Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's very nice in these times of budget cuts to see a full room. I'll admit to you that we were sitting a couple of weeks ago thinking, wonder if people really still go to UGMs or not. You know, is that a sort of dinosaur or not? But I'm happy to see that there's an awful lot of people here. So welcome to our sixth US user group meeting and the third one that we're having here in San Diego. And this Catamaran Hotel has kind of become our home here because we always come back. We just like it so much that we decided never to change the format. So it's really good to see a lot of people here. Now, a lot of you are, I would categorize the audience into maybe three principal groups, or four. One is the ChemAxon people, but let's put those to one side. There are many of you who are coming out of industry in the sense of pharmaceutical research in pharma or biotech companies. There are some of you who are rather from the academic side of the world, also involved in one way or another in research. And there's quite a lot of you also who are actually what the other two groups would call vendors, which means that you are some way involved in the software business for the most part. And one thing that is useful for the first two categories to know is that we do have a lot of so-called vendors here. We call them partners because they have integrated our software into their solutions. So for me, a vendor is actually also a customer. So it's also a valid attendee of a user group meeting. But for you, it means that not only is this a ChemAxon user group meeting, I did wonder with a number of Schrödinger people here whether I'd come to the wrong user group meeting and that I actually stepped accidentally into a Schrödinger user group meeting. But there are a lot of our so-called partners here. So it does give categories 1 and 2 a great opportunity to mix with category 3. You don't just get one sort of vendor to talk to here, you get a community of vendors. And I think that's a very useful thing. This has almost become a kind of networking event in of itself. And I know a number of people who've come here not only because it was a ChemAxon user group meeting, but because they knew that they could meet a lot of their other partners. Part of the opportunity around that, if I do the smallest part of sales pitch at all, is of course to see what those opportunities mean for you, since there are a lot of integration type of programs that we've got, and lots of examples, some of which you're going to see on the slides here during the course of the next 2 days, about how our software works in conjunction with other people's software. So take the opportunity to meet all the other vendors who are also our customers, and I do thank all of them for coming too. The other thing that I think you'll see a heavy focus on in this meeting is we recently had our version 6.0 release in May, and we just had, I think yesterday, the 6.1 on that. So there's some quite interesting new stuff, and it will be presented in the various ChemAxon presentations. I'll delve increasingly into the area of the end user. And there'll also be some quite interesting roadmappy stuff about how we see some of that going up forward. So there's a lot of new stuff from ChemAxon as well coming up in the next couple of days. Now, for those of you who are regular attendees, you may know that I try not to talk too much at the beginning, and the opening session is usually by way of a keynote with a guest speaker. We've had people from Pfizer and BMS and Abbott and so forth in the past. Today, I've got a very special guest. Actually, I think much more in the field of science. He got originally a bachelor's degree at Fairfield University in maths and chemistry, and then a PhD from Yale in chemistry. He's one of the founders of Vertex, and amazingly and stunningly, I think he's the only person I've ever met who's actually got 5 marketed drugs to his name. He's got over 85 publications, so a man I stand scientifically in awe of. In his spare time, if there is any, he's on the advisory board of many different discovery companies, and he's been on the advisory board of Schrödinger since 2008. And he has taken up a more sort of semi-permanent role there as strategic advisor also as SVP and board member for strategic alliances. So, and when he really has completely spare time out of all that, he is very interested in history. And if I understood correctly yesterday evening, he even makes his own medieval armor. Is that right? Siege weapons, right. Which he has not brought with him, but it is my tremendous pleasure to welcome to the podium Dr. Mark Murcko. Now, we'll do the old axe throwing later on, yeah. Sure. Axe throwing and stuff on the beach later on. So it's not as many as you probably know, and since it was also press released recently, it's not a big secret that ChemAxon and Schrödinger have a relationship going back to the times when Schrödinger purchased Synaptic Science and the Seurat program that goes with it. And we recently extended that relationship out into a further 5-year term. And I think in the industry, that's a relatively unusual thing. I always say in the automobile industry, there are lots of examples of people collaborating on gearboxes and engines and then fighting it out in the forecourt for the end product. But in our industry, we don't see this collaboration very much. So just with your Schrödinger hat on for a minute, can you just let me know how Schrödinger views that and what's behind that, what's behind doing that?
So, morning, everybody. I think that Schrödinger is a company that's historically been focused on really physics-based methods development, so things like docking and scoring and pharmacophore development, quantum mechanics, prediction of pKa, and really physics-based science. And a couple of years ago, there's a bit of a shift, not away from that, but to add more tools to help with decision-making. Because no matter how good the tools are, if they're not used properly, you don't get value out of them. So the idea a few years ago was to move into building more of an informatics platform that can be used to provide decision support for pharmaceutical companies and for other types of science professionals. So to do that, of course, is a huge challenge. It's a huge build, and ChemAxon obviously has a lot of unique talents that Schrödinger historically did not have. And so rather than trying to reinvent the wheel and build everything from scratch, it seemed very sensible to try to extend the partnership between Schrödinger and ChemAxon to try to help to build those decision support tools that then would enable, hopefully, better use of the science that Schrödinger's always been developing. So that in a nutshell is the reason.
Okay, that's cool. Thank you. One of the things that I often say, without meaning to get into a debate over which is better, iPhone or Android, is that part of our business model could be described as an Android kind of business model. So it's an open platform that's accessible to anyone. And in the same way as that Google even has its own hardware in certain circumstances. But many different providers can use the same platform, and we're sort of very agnostic in that sense as well. So I think that fits very well. I think we have other examples, and we have the partner program or partner session later on. But for me, this is a very, very, very nice example of how that works, and we're very happy with that. Yep. I mentioned earlier that you're on the advisory board of a number of companies, most of which are in the area of drug discovery itself, which of course you're an absolute wizard at. But you've been on the advisory board of Schrödinger for a while, which is more in the field of, well, it's science, it's software related to science, more, let's say more scientific than some of what we do. What sort of advice do you give people like Schrödinger? And what would you give people like us in the software business?
So I think we've already talked about one of those things, which is collaboration. So I think one of the things that Schrödinger has really focused on is getting value out of collaborations like this one, but also the scientific advisory board at Schrödinger is actually pretty deeply involved in what goes on there. So some of the technology that Schrödinger sells originated through collaborations with scientific advisory board members. So finding everybody knows Moore's law, right? Things double every 18 months. But have you heard Joy's law? Who here knows Joy's law? Really? I would have thought this crowd. So Joy's law, Bill Joy, the guy who founded Sun Microsystems, he said, no matter how smart all of your people are, most of the smart people work for somebody else. So I've always been a huge believer in that. So I've always, when I was at Vertex, when I was the chief technology officer there, I was always trying to build collaborations, right? So I think that's a really key point. That's advice I give everybody. Another thing I think that's good advice for Schrödinger and for ChemAxon and for the world in general is to not reinvent the wheel, because there's so many examples that I see of people trying to do the same things over and over again.
So why doesn't Schrödinger build toolkits so that you can rely on other people being smart and using the toolkits?
Right. So the question for those of you who didn't hear it was, why doesn't Schrödinger build toolkits? And so,
there's smart people out
yeah.
there.
So there may be some other smart people out there. Oh, okay. So I think that I don't want to get into the product that's going to follow from Seurat. It's called Live Design, but Live Design is actually built from the ground up to be entirely, plug and play with, any other capability that exists, any other tool or technology or scoring function or predictive model or visualization, whatever it is. It's the idea is to make sure that it's completely, intercompatible. And that's because, when I was at Vertex, the group that I ran, one of the groups that I ran, was responsible for also building software, and we had a lot of experience developing tools. Some of you may know Pat Walters. Pat. Yeah. So yeah, all the OpenEye tools originated at Vertex. Perhaps you didn't know that. The founding toolkit at OpenEye came from Vertex. The first employee of OpenEye, he took it with him when he left Vertex. We gave it to them because we wanted to try to create more of an open environment because we think it makes sense to not reinvent wheels. And so in the same token, built on that experience that I had a decade ago, the thinking behind live design is to make it as totally open and connectable as it can be, because why do you want to reinvent wheels? And if you're thinking about, again, back to advice, if you're thinking about how to get the most value out of the informatics professionals in an organization or the scientists in an organization, you really want them focusing on the little internal bits, the things that are unique to that company, right? So it may be that within your organization you have a tremendous wealth of data on, efflux. You may have lots of great internal experimental data on PGP. And so using your time to build predictive models built around that unique proprietary internal knowledge is a good use of time. But spending your time redoing what, say, ChemAxon has already done is not the sort of thing that really adds much value. So the advice I give people everywhere I go is really think hard about what would be a unique contribution, what would really add the most value to your company, and do that. Because I don't know, obviously all of you in the room, but I don't know if, for example, you spend a lot of time talking to like heads of chemistry, heads of biology, heads of research. How many people in the room would commonly have those kinds of interactions? So some, maybe a third or quarter of the people in the room. So when I talk to folks like that, what I hear often is a real pent-up sense of frustration with computational professionals broadly defined. So whether you think of yourself as a modeler or an informatics specialist, the chances are that the people 3 or 4 levels above you in your organization are not completely satisfied with what comes out of your shop, because it doesn't always address the most critical needs that your organizations have. And so the advice I give is to really try to stay very focused on the things that would make those people believe that you've added value to the programs that are of greatest interest to them.
Well, it kind of leads quite nicely into one of my other questions to you was, since let's say from the perspective of a software company or any vendor, you are what we describe as an end user, which is it's just to put you in a little box,
Sure.
But of course you prefer the term scientist. How
6 of 1.
How is your relationship with your IT managers? Because you're on the research side. So how has your relationship with your IT managers been, and how have you managed that, and what have you found the biggest challenges?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and first of all, I hired all the IT people at Vertex, so that helped.
Okay.
But what I've always found is that IT people who really are more interested in sort of the mission of the organization rather than the tools themselves, I find that those are the folks who have tended to do the best. And I see this, by the way, everywhere I go. So if I go in and if I'm working with a large or a small organization and I look at their IT group and I look at how that group interacts with the rest of the scientific organization, the groups that seem to be the most successful are the ones that have people in those groups who themselves either have strong science backgrounds or really have made it their mission to do whatever they can to support that organization. So it's not that they're technically incompetent. They're very competent technically, but the thing that gets them the most excited is not some new feature, in Ruby on Rails, but it would be rather that if we take all of these tools and we put them together in this way, we can produce a solution to this problem that we know is plaguing our scientists. And so it's that kind of, I'd say, end user orientation actually, that ends up making those groups more successful, I think, because there's smart people everywhere, as we've already discussed. So every IT group has really smart people in it. So the issue is not IQ points. It's really, I think, more about organization and sort of a focus and which direction you want to steer.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And direction is my last question for you, really, which is. I remember when we talked on the phone a couple of months ago, you said that you've had lots of experience of how not to make good software in the stuff that you've been dealing with.
Yeah.
You were very tactful just now to not want to tell me what was your favorite piece of software. But where do you see that going in the future then? So what's your, how is the software and potentially the hardware that goes around it going to look like in 3 or 5 years' time? What would you expect your scientists to have in their hand or on their desktop or wherever it's going to be?
It's a great question. Of course, this is just crystal ball gazing, so just my opinion. But when I look at what the challenges are in science, I'm seeing things like a need to understand allostery, a need to understand slow kinetic off rates, a need to be able to understand how to design non-Lipinski compounds, so say macrocycles as an example, undruggable targets. Those are the scientific challenges. Being able to predict polymorphs, being able to predict formulation differences, being able to better understand how to use structural information to predict ADME. So being able to use the growing body of X-ray data for example, P450 enzymes to try to predict sites of metabolism on drug candidates. So these are examples of the science challenges. And so when I think about what I would like to see the software industry doing over the next, say, 5 years, it would be focusing on coming up with ways to be able to address those kinds of challenges. So for me, products like Seurat and Live Design are absolutely essential because nobody is smart enough to anticipate all the challenges. And so what I always wanted to have at Vertex, and I never quite was able to build it, was a system that would anticipate my needs, a system that would look at the data and say, oh, were you aware that this other compound was reported in a paper in JMed Chem from Eli Lilly in 1980, and it's 83% similar to your compound, and here's the synthetic route. Did you know that compound existed? Well, of course I didn't, because you can't know everything. Or did you know that this new series that you're exploring starts to encroach upon this IP space? Do you want to look at the patent claims? Do you want to look at the figures? So having tools that are able to incorporate that sort of assisting, if you will, by using curated information in an intelligent way, I think that's a big part of it as well. So it's not just about making better tools for predicting binding and scoring. Those are happening. I mean, there's no question that there's a huge investment still being made to make those kinds of products better. But I think tools that help with decision support, that help to guide scientific efforts, things that many of us in this room are working hard on, I think that's a huge new direction, or continued direction, I should say. There's no question that right now, less than 1% of the potential value of scientific information is being used routinely within any organization in the pharmaceutical industry. Far less than 1%, I would argue. And so the challenge for all of us is to figure out how to organize, sift through, curate that information, and add the best cutting-edge scientific tools and put that together in a package that's not just easy to use, but is truly a joy to use. So that's something that I don't think has ever existed in this industry. So that's my vision.
I think you've just thrown down the gauntlet there, haven't you?
Yeah. And it's a hard problem, So it's just, if I think about just what Schrödinger is doing, there's 40 people in Scott's group that are just building Live Design. And they're people from Google and Microsoft and Facebook. Yep. And because that's the technology that you need to bring to bear to be able to tackle that kind of a big challenge.
I think that's a very interesting point, that you've got all these people who are outside of the typical just discovery industry working on that team. And that's probably a good way to get new ideas in, because I think if you're too stuck in just the same old people from the informatics community that we live in is relatively small. We meet the same people over and over again, which is great. But I think it's really interesting that you guys are mixing that up.
I think that's right, because I know my own limitations. So just speaking for myself, I'm not trying to project any of this onto any of you, but I can write Fortran and C and maybe C++ code, but I'm a PhD chemist. I'm not a computer scientist. And so if you ask me to build a system that addresses those huge challenges that we've been talking about, I'm not really the guy to do that. I might have some thoughts about what it should look like and what the user flow should be and what the scientific challenges are, but to build tools like that, what you said is absolutely right. We have to bring in people who have those kinds of different skills. And then it comes back to what we were talking about before. What makes an IT group successful is that they're focused on solving those challenges. And so the cool thing, I think, about the people that Schrödinger has been trying to hire is that they're, of course, computer scientists, but they're also excited about doing something for medicine,
right.
Which not everybody is.
Yep.
But if you find people that kind of do both, right, if they're really good at the computer science and they're excited about medicine, then they kind of have the right phenotype for being able to tackle a problem.
If you go around most pharma companies, somewhere on the wall there'll be a mantra like the patient is waiting, and that's what it's about. So.
That is, and unfortunately, all of us are, and this was true at Vertex just as well as I'm sure it's true at every other organization. No matter how good the team is, it's never as big as it could be, and it's got other, there's always other limitations we all face. We have other time pressures and restraints, right? And so it's very hard to do everything. So you have to think about where to focus your energy. And so my goal now that I'm not in any one organization, but I try to think of myself as trying to understand what the industry needs. I ask myself, what is it that we could do that would provide a really good basis, a really good launch point for better decision making, for better science, for better integration of science. And then my hope is that then becomes widely used, because then the folks in organizations can focus on the more unique, specific problems that they have, that you have, the ones that apply just to your particular projects, where you have, again, unique internal data that no one else has. You can apply your knowledge and your experience to solving those challenges and not to worrying about, the core of the infrastructure, which hopefully, if we do this right, it'll be a good launch pad. It'll be a good starting point for then having the right sort of decision-making apparatus.
Mark, thanks very much.
Sure.
I think we could chew the cud on this one for a long time. Mark is going to be around for the rest of today, I think. We leave tomorrow morning already. So if you want to find out how to make $1 million drug, please grab him in the coffee break. But thank you very much for joining me, and enjoy the rest of your stay here. Thank you.